Good morning, all of you. This is time that we discuss Michael Foucault. As we know, the theories of sexualism and post-sexualism had its birth in France. Sexualism was initiated by Ferdinand de Saussure, a Swiss-born French philosopher and linguist. And post-sexualism was initiated by Derrida and Roland Barthes. Both belonged to France. So, theories of structuralism and post-structuralism all had its birth in France. Say from 1950 onwards. Structuralism came in 1950s and post-structuralism came in 1970s. And it is at the same time we come to find another French philosopher, linguist, historian, political activist, literary critic and transdisciplinary scholar, Michael Foucault. One of the very important names in the modern theoretical studies. And Foucault seems to be a tough area as far as our literature students are concerned. And we are actually now trying to demystify the concept of difficulty with regard to understanding Michael Foucault. Michael Foucault was born in 1926 and he died when he was only 57 years of age. And he died due to HIV and AIDS disease, the dreaded disease. And he was the first popular person to become affected by the HIV and to face death due to that disease. And Foucault, I told you, philosopher, historian, political activist, literary critic, and transdisciplinary scholar. And there are a few favorite areas discussed by Foucault, like power, knowledge, madness, and there are jargons like Panopticon, GENIOLOGY, and these are the areas Foucault made contributions. And he is often regarded as a structuralist and post-structuralist. He is also regarded as a postmodern thinker, but he rejected all these labels. He never wanted to be regarded as a structuralist or a deconstructionist or a postmodern Marxist thinker. His thoughts have greatly influenced academics, especially in the fields of anthropology, psychology, sociology, criminology, cultural studies, literary theory, and various areas. The academics of all these areas were greatly influenced by Michael Foucault. So he also had his theories on feminism, Marxism, and critical theories. And he was born in Poitiers district in France, in an upper middle class family. And he studied at the prestigious French universities like Sorbonne. And while studying at the university, Louis Althusser was his professor. Althusser is a very popular Marxist philosopher. And Althusser was his professor. And Foucault developed the communist ideology from Louis Althusser. And Foucault earned his degrees in philosophy and psychology. Then he went abroad for a few years working as a cultural diplomat and returned to France and published his first major work entitled The History of Madness. So from Foucault we have to remember a few literary works. We have to remember the books written by Foucault and the themes discussed by him. This is one approach of learning Foucault. Foucault published his first book, The History of Madness. It was in 1961. And in 1963 he produced another book called Birth of the Clinic. And in these books he discussed the question of madness, criminality, and so the prevalent criminal activities connected with power and the question of power and knowledge. These were all discussed in the books written by Foucault. He started the first book, The History of Madness, 1961, and then his next book, Birth of the Clinic, came out in 1963, and in 1966 he brought out another book called The Order of Things. And these books actually displayed his increasing involvement in secularism. And these all books mentioned now, like The History of Madness, The Birth of the Clinic, and The Order of Things. These all displayed his increasing involvement in secularism theory. And he started giving lectures at the University of Tunis and became the head of the Department of Psychology. Started delivering philosophical lectures and became the head of the Department of Philosophy in the University of Tunis. And in 1969, he brought out his famous book, The Archaeology of Knowledge. It was published in 1969. In 1970, he was admitted to the Collège de France. And this position he retained all through his life. He was appointed as professor at the Collège de France. And he continued to remain in the position until his death. And he became active in several intellectual groups also, and involved in campaigns against racism and human rights movements. And he published another famous book called Discipline and Punish. So it was in 1975 he brought out his very famous book Discipline and Punish, and it is in this book we come to find the idea of Panopticon developed by him. And Panopticon was one question asked by UGC, and the question of UGC was, the theory of Panopticon was associated with which philosopher? Actually it was Foucault who developed the theory of Panopticon. Actually he borrowed the idea from Jeremy Bentham. It was Jeremy Bentham who spoke about the Panopticon and Panopticism. And he was a philosopher of utilitarian school of philosophy. And he developed the idea of Panopticon. And the theory was also called Pannomian. And it was from Jeremy Bentham. Michael Foucault adopted the term Panopticon. And the term Panopticon is discussed in his book Discipline and Punish. UGC used to ask questions from this particular book. And I have seen 2 times questions asked from this book. One was about Panopticon, and the other was about the children to be brought up in which kind of atmosphere. And the discipline to be practiced, in fact, to control the children should be in which kind of perspective. What should be the perspective of keeping children disciplinary? And this book, Discipline and Punish, The Birth of Prison. And the subtitle is also very famous, Discipline and Punish, The Birth of Prison. And it was brought out by him in 1975. In 1976, he brought out the next important book called The History of Sexuality. And in this book, he developed the genealogical methods which emphasized the role that power plays in society. And it was one of the favorite subjects of Michael Foucault, that power and its connection with knowledge. And it is in this book, The History of Sexuality, he developed the ideas of genealogical methods which emphasized the role that power plays in society. And once again, I do want to remind you of the books written by Foucault. The first major book written by him was The History of Madness. It was in 1961. And in 1963, he brought out the book Birth of the Clinic. In 1966, he came out with his book The Order of Things. And in 1969, he produced the Archaeology of Knowledge. And in 1975, he brought out the book Discipline and Punish, The Birth of Prison. And the title that we have to remember always, Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison. And it is a seminal book written by Michael Foucault. And in 1976, he brought out the book The History of Sexuality. And Foucault is remembered mainly for all these books and the ideas contained in these books. And there are a number of jargons and literary terms developed by Foucault. And I told you in the beginning of the class itself that he died in Paris from complications of HIV/AIDS, and he became the first public figure in France to die from complications of the disease called AIDS. And Foucault was actually a scholar who was like Lacan, Claude Lévi-Strauss, and Roland Barthes. And he was also friends with these people. And he became friends with Jean-Paul Sartre, the existential novelist. And both criticized one another in the press. Even though they were friends, Sartre and Foucault were friends, they criticized each other through medias. And Sartre attacked Foucault, calling him a bourgeois, while Foucault attacked Sartre for being a Marxist. And Sartre was a Marxist, and Foucault could not be called a Marxist, even though he had imbibed the ideas of Marxism and discussed Marxism in his books. He could not be termed as a Marxist. And it was this reason why Sartre called him a bourgeois. And Foucault criticized Sartre for being a Marxist. And very interestingly, he once maintained the idea, Foucault maintained the idea that Marxism exists only in the 19th century, though as a fish exists in water. In the opinion of Foucault, Marxism existed in the 19th century like a fish existing in water. That is, it ceases to breathe anywhere else. Actually, Marxism can breathe only in the 19th century, and it existed like a fish in the water of 19th century. And when the century passed, Marxism lost its importance. It ceased its existence anywhere else. And this is time that we discuss the jargons produced by Michael Foucault. And very interestingly, we discuss a few essays of Foucault also. A few of them are lectures made by him. Very interestingly, he had produced a lecture entitled "What is an Author?" and he published it as an essay. What is an author? And it is in this regard, we remember the essay written by Roland Barthes, Death of the Author. Death of the Author was a book written by Roland Barthes, a post-sectoralist, who started as a sectoralist and changed to become a post-sectoralist and the co-founder of the post-sectoralist movement. Roland Barthes, with the publication of his seminal essay, Death of the Author, introduced post-sectoralist thinking in language and literature. According to Roland Barthes, when a book is published, the role of the author becomes ended there. The author has got no role when the book is published. The author becomes dead and the reader becomes alive. The reader takes his birth and the author becomes dead when a book is published. The author has got no role to say anything. So his saying will be over when the book is published. And it is time for the reader to interpret the book. And this actually initiated the post-sectoralist thinking. In Roland Barthes' book, Death of an Author became very popular as a beginning book for the post-sectoralist movement. And Foucault was aware of it. In fact, he could not accept the view presented by Roland Barthes in his essay, The Death of the Author. And in fact, when Foucault got a chance to attack Roland Barthes, he produced a lecture, and the lecture was later published as What is an Author? And it was actually a lecture delivered by him at the Collège de France in February 1969, on 22nd February 1969. And here he considers the relation between author, text and reader. And it is in this lecture he produced the concept of the author function and describes its characteristics. And when Roland Barthes maintained the idea that with the publication of a book, the role of the author becomes ended. And in the opinion of Foucault, the author becomes alive after the publication of the book. He becomes more alive, and there is the author's function. And there are two types of position for the author. The first one is trans-discursive position. A person can be the author of not only a book, and this is trans-discursive position. There are two positions for an author. The first one is trans-discursive position. A person can be the author of a book, and at the same time, he can be the author of a theory or a tradition. And in that tradition, or based on that theory, new books and new ideas can proliferate in the society. The author is not only the writer of the book, but also produces his theories and brings out his tradition also. And this may help the new writers to produce books and proliferate, circulate the theories. So discussion will be made by the people on books written by the authors. And this is the trans-discursive position. An author is not only the author of a book, but also the author of a number of theories and traditions. And the traditions will be imbibed by the later generation. And the theories will be discussed by the later writers. And they may produce various books on the theories produced by the authors. For example, Homer's book like Odyssey and Iliad, adopted by Virgil as Aeneid. And in the modern times also we come to find that there are many writers adopting the Homerian stories. James Joyce adopted Homer in his book Ulysses. And we have seen Tennyson and Derek Walcott adopting the Homeric themes. And in the opinion of Michael Foucault, an author can have a trans-discursive position. He is not only the author of a certain book, but also the author of some theories that the future generation may adopt. And he may be the author of some tradition that the future generation may adopt and practice. And in this regard, we come to find the examples of Homer. And there is also the example of Aristotle. And there are the examples of the early church fathers who dictated the biblical parables and stories. And the message conveyed by them are to be taken into consideration. Homer was adopted by the later writers, and the philosophy of Aristotle was proliferated in the later periods, and the early church fathers were adopted and reiterated in the modern times. And when an author comes to such a position, it is called the trans-discursive